Hey, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today we're going to show you how to rebuild your front and your rear prop shaft on your Polaris RZR. It's going to be a similar process for your 2-seaters and your 4-seaters. Now if you're not sure if you need to rebuild yours or not, you want to inspect your U-joints. So if you hear a clunking sound or if you hear squeaking from these, you're definitely going to want to inspect them. So if you feel any play in there, they're bad and they definitely need to be replaced because eventually they can break and cause further damage. So you don't want that to happen. Take care of it. Now the other thing we're doing on here is replacing this carrier bearing. So if you're having any issues with that, we're going to show you how to do that as well, or if you're just upgrading that. So with all that being said, make sure you reference your model specific service manual throughout the process, but let's go ahead and get started. If you need help with the removal and reinstallation of your prop shaft, we've got a how-to video for that, so be sure and check it out. For parts, we have several options on our website for both OE and aftermarket. So we're going with 3 of the Tusk U-joint kits. These come with the necessary clips, the roll pin, and options for the Zerk. So that way you can get whatever Zerk works best for you. Now for the carrier bearing, we're using the one from the OE diagram, but if you want to get an aftermarket upgrade, you can do that as well. There's a few different options on there, but this one's from Sandcraft, and this actually relocates the drive shaft just to the side, and it's supposed to help reduce vibration under load. So again, we've got several different options on our website, so go check that out. To do this job, there's some tools that are nice to have and tools that you need to have. So obviously we have some common hand tools. Now if you're doing the carrier bearing, you're going to need a bearing puller. This one's from Tusk. This one's actually for crank bearings and gears, but it's going to work just fine for this. And then we have a 1 1/4 inch inside diameter pipe to drive on our new bearing. We're also using a grease gun, and we're going to be using some green Loctite when we reinstall that bearing. Now, stuff that's nice to have. This is a Motion Pro clip installer tool. That's going to make the job a lot easier. And then the other thing that I highly recommend but isn't absolutely necessary is this Tusk U-joint press tool. That's going to help remove your old U-joint and install the new ones without damaging your parts. But if you don't have this, it is possible to do the job with a vise. It's just not going to be as easy. We're going to start out with the carrier bearing, and the first thing we need to do is remove the rubber bearing support. So we're going to rock that off. You just want to tip one side forward, it's going to peel off, and then you can slide the whole thing off. There we go. So now we can take our bearing puller. We're going to go on the back side of this bearing. We'll tighten it down. And when you tighten these down, you don't want to go too far. You don't want the tool clamping on the shaft. Also keep in mind there's a little collar where it actually kind of raises up just a little bit, and you're going to want to make sure the tool clears that. So we'll slide on the press plate, and with the center bolt you just want to make sure you have some grease on it. Now we're just going to tighten down the center bolt and remove that bearing. Now I'm just using contact cleaner for the final cleaning, and I'm going to use this on the inside of the new bearing as well, and that's because we're going to apply that green thread lock to this area. So to install that new bearing, we've got the Loctite on our shaft already on that sealing surface. You're going to want to make sure you have a pipe. Again, this is a 1 1/4 inch inside diameter pipe. It's going to fit on the inside race on that bearing. So we can go ahead and drive this on, and we're just leaving the bearing support in place since on this one we don't need to remove it. But if you have a bearing carrier that it came with the bearing separate from this, just install the bearing first and then the support. So I've set the bearing in place, and then I'm just going to tap around the pipe until the bearing is all the way seated in place. So again, we're all the way seated. It's as simple as that. So now we can move on to the U-joints. Now for these U-joints, in the prop shaft removal video, we talked about keeping everything in phase. Now we want to make sure that the shafts stay balanced when we take things off and put them back together. So to keep things exactly as they were, I'm just going to put a dot on each side of the yoke before we take the joint apart. And when we go back together, we'll make sure that this side of the yoke is facing this side of the drive shaft. So with that being said, there's 4 clips on the U-joint that we need to remove. They're right down here inside each of the yokes. So I'm just going to use a punch to tap those off. And if they don't pop all the way out with the punch, you can use a screwdriver. Now the next step is to press each bearing cap out one at a time. So again, you can do this with a vise or with the tool that's actually made for it. So the first thing we're going to do is get the correct size drive adapter. So this one's the 20 millimeter. That looks pretty dang good for that cap. So the next thing you want to do is get the right size adapter to support the yoke. So you want to make sure this cap is going to fit down in there. So this one's actually too small. We're going to get the 27 millimeter, and that's going to allow that cap to be pressed all the way through the yoke, and it's not going to catch on this adapter. So to get this thing together, you're going to take the base plate and the press plate. The two bolts are going to go in the sides. Then we're going to take the center bolt. I'm applying just a little grease to that O-ring as well as to the threads. We'll thread that into the press plate, and with that started, we can install our adapters. And from here we can use the tool just like this, but for me it's a little bit easier if I set the base plate in a vise. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now we can set our U-joint into the tool, and what we're going to do is press the U-joint away from the drive shaft first. That way we just have this smaller yoke to deal with, and then we can finish pressing out the U-joints. Now once you have everything lined up, you want to tighten down the center bolt. That's going to start pressing the caps through. Now if your U-joint has a lot of corrosion and it's not breaking free, one thing that is nice about this tool is the press plate actually floats on these two bolts. So what you can do to help break it free is use a hammer to hit on the center bolt. But for us, tightening it down is going to work just fine. So once you bottom out, you can back off the center bolt and then remove the joint from the tool. You can see the bearing cap is still in there, but it's loose. We can just pull that with our fingers, just a little grease still holding it on. So now the move is to press on this side where we just removed that bearing cap, and we're going to press this bearing cap all the way through. So now we can take that other bearing cap off, and we're going to remove that spider or this cross section and separate the yokes. Then we're just going to do that same process for the remaining two caps. So we'll pull that last cup off, and this cross section will just come out like that. Now for the new U-joint, we have a few different options for grease zerks. There's a cap, or you've got a 90 and a 45. So we're going to use the 45, and when you install this, you want to make sure it's in a location you're actually going to be able to use it. So we're going to go right in between both of these posts when we tighten it down. And then when you install this back onto the yokes, these caps, they're actually going to have to be off. So we'll just slide them off, and be careful because there's little needles down inside of here, and you want to make sure all of those are in place. If they're not, you can use a small flat blade screwdriver to poke them back into place. And if it looks like there's not enough grease, you can add just a little bit, but ours is looking good. And then when we install this cross member into the yoke, I want to make sure that the grease zerk is away from these splines, because that means there's going to be a shaft that comes up in here, and I don't want it to damage the zerk. Now I'm just using contact cleaner for the final cleaning. So I'm going to come up to the press tool. I'm going to make sure that we have just a little bit of grease on the surface where that cap's going to go in or press in. And same thing on the cap itself. Then I'm going to start this by hand. Again, make sure all of the needles are in place. We're going to line that up as best as we can, and then we're going to press that cap all the way in until we can see the retaining ring groove. Once you have the cap pressed all the way in, you can take one of the circlips, and this is the Motion Pro circlip installer tool. It's going to make your life a little easier. Now one thing to keep in mind, if you press the bearing cap on too far and you have a little gap between the clip and the yoke, you want to press down on this until it's flush, just barely seat it, and that way the universal joint isn't going to bind once everything's together. Perfectly square. Now we can do the same thing for the next cap. As you press the last two caps on, make sure that you have your indexing marks lined up. Moving on to the front prop shaft, the process is going to be just like the U-joint for the rear prop. Now that we have everything assembled, since we did use the zerks, we might pump 1 or 2 pumps of grease into those just to be safe. And that's all there is to rebuilding the prop shafts on your Polaris RZRs, whether it's the 2-seaters or the 4-seaters. Now, if you have any questions about the replacement process, leave those down in the comments below. And if you need any of these parts, you can pick them up on our website. Now, for more helpful content like this, subscribe to our channel. I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Thanks for watching.